Good afternoon. Good afternoon. This is Jamaica Live. I'm Bruce Bowling. We're on Bridge 99, coming to you live from our studios on Devon Road in Kingston, Jamaica. We link in the course of the program with Irish Jam in New York so that we can bring our Jamaicans in that diaspora into the program. Today is the 27th of February, almost the end of the month. You know, when I was a youngster growing up, a year looked like an eternity. And the older you get is the shorter it appears to be. I mean, when you get to my age, a year looks more like a month. But we give thanks. We're still here, still alive, still in good health. Thank God. We do this every Monday. It's a single issue discussion program, you know. Each week we don't jump all over the place. We select a topic that we think is important. We focus on it. We try to engage guests who can help us to better understand the issues that are involved, delve into it. We get contending views from time to time, different perspectives, but we do all of that in the hope that we can help you to come to your own conclusions, to form your own opinions on these issues. That's what we do, and we do it every Monday. It's Jamaica Live. We're on Bridge 99. Three weeks ago, we witnessed the immense tragedy resulting from the magnitude 7.8 earthquake that struck sections of Turkey and Syria. Over 50,000 people were killed, 50,000, and hundreds of thousands suffered injuries. More than 170,000 buildings, some of them high-rise buildings, collapsed or were extensively damaged. Many roads and bridges were destroyed. Turkey lies between two, what are called tectonic plates. And Turkey sits on two fault lines where earthquakes usually originate. And that makes Turkey extremely susceptible to earthquakes. In fact, in the last century, there have been 15 major earthquakes in Turkey. And when I say major earthquakes, I'm talking about earthquakes measuring magnitude 7.0 or more. Media reports suggest that building regulations in Turkey are very weak, and even those weak regulations are not vigorously enforced. A video was shown of Turkish President Recep Erdogan at a campaign rally during the 2019 elections. And he was boasting about how many new housing projects had been built during his administration because the government had granted waivers to developers to exempt them from complying with certain building requirements. Well, we now see what the consequences of that decision were. Jamaica is also susceptible to earthquakes. Jamaica, Haiti, and the Dominican Republic all straddle the Enriquillo Planting Garden Fault Zone, a major fault system that runs west to east between the Caribbean and North American tectonic plates. We can recall the magnitude 7.0 earthquake that hit Haiti in 2010. Haiti didn't have many high-rise structures, but because of the poor condition of many of its buildings and the absence of proper building regulations, more than 220,000 persons were killed. 220,000 people died as a result of that earthquake in 2010. Haiti was again hit with an even more powerful earthquake, this time magnitude 7.2 in 2021. Although the area that was most affected was not densely populated and the loss of lives and damage to buildings were nowhere as severe as in 2010. We in Jamaica have been under the grace of God. Even since the big one in Haiti in 2010, Haiti has had 4 more earthquakes exceeding magnitude 5.0. And we are on the same fault line as Haiti. But we have had only 4 earthquakes measuring 5.0 or more in the last 123 years. Haiti has had 4 of those earthquakes since 2010. That's what, in the last 12, 13 years. We have had 4, only 4 in the last 123 years. Now, the last significant earthquake that we had in Jamaica was in 1907. And that was a magnitude 6.2, which is still below the major earthquake category of magnitude 7.0 and above. That earthquake that we had in 1907 left over 1,000 people dead. And we must bear in mind that at that time, our population was barely a quarter of what it is today. So you can imagine if we had that kind of earthquake, what our death toll could possibly be today. But that earthquake, the one in 1907, caused, apart from the over 1,000 people who were killed, caused severe structural damage, especially in Kingston, Buff Bay, and Anata Bay. By the law of averages, a major earthquake in Jamaica is long overdue. But we have been blessed and we have been spared by the grace of God. But you know, we don't run God's business. And we can't tell what might happen tomorrow, or next week, or next month, or next year. And the thing about it is that, unlike other natural disasters like a hurricane, earthquakes don't give you any warning. We can see when a hurricane is coming, sometimes for as much as a week before it arrives. We can track it from when it leaves Cape Verde on the western coast of Africa. We can determine whether the conditions, the conditions like the ocean and air temperatures, the atmospheric pressure, whether those conditions are likely to cause it to strengthen and intensify. We can measure the force of the winds to tell us exactly how strong those winds are and what kind of damage those winds are capable of doing. And we can measure the amount of rain that it is carrying with it. So we have ample time to prepare ourselves, to put some heavy concrete blocks on our shaky zinc roof, to drape a piece of tarpaulin over the roof so that we can stop it from leaking. We have enough time to stock up on food. only for tin stuff. We have enough time to buy some flashlights and some candles. We have enough time to board up the windows, to move to higher ground or check into a designated shelter somewhere. You know, I can remember it's my first recollection as a human being. The 1951 Hurricane Charlie. And I remember my mother put me and my two brothers, when the breeze started to blow, she put the three of us under the bed in order to protect us in the event that, you know, the roof come crashing down on us. When an earthquake strikes, it doesn't give any warning. It leaves us no time to do anything. We may be fast asleep in our beds when the house starts to shake and the roof collapses on us. And if we live in low-lying areas along the coast, as most of our population does, most of the Jamaican population don't live in the hills. We live along the coastline, right around Jamaica, from Kingston to Portmore, Lionel Town, Alligator Pond. I mean, you name it, Black River, Savlamar, Negril, Lucy, Montego Bay, St. Anne's Bay, Ocho Rios, Port Maria. Most of the population lives along the coast, and when a hurricane comes, those areas are particularly vulnerable. Because when an earthquake comes, it can cause a tsunami that can produce storm surges of as tall as 25 feet and more. And them kind of storm surges will swallow up a house and everything and everybody that is in it. You know, remember Hurricane Gilbert in 1988? To just tell you how powerful storm surges can be. That hurricane caused storm surges because of the strength of the winds. And I remember the storm surge lifted up a boulder that was about 8 feet in diameter. I don't know where the boulder was, but the storm surge lifted up that boulder and deposited it in the middle of the road near Galena on the St. Mary coast. So when you're talking about an earthquake now, you're talking about something that can cause even bigger storm surges than a hurricane. Hurricane is breeze. An earthquake is when the foundation on which we rest is disturbed. And that disturbs the sea, and it can cause bigger storm surges than would be created by a hurricane. And bear in mind, you know, that we're an island, we're completely surrounded by water, by sea, and therefore a storm surge can occur at any point along the 635 miles of coastline that we have. We also have in Jamaica many high-rise buildings. The Pegasus Hotel in New Kingston has 17 floors. The Scotiabank Center in downtown Kingston has 15 floors. And we now hear that work is to begin shortly on a 27-story building on Oxford Road. And that building is going to be more than 1.5 times taller than the Pegasus Hotel. How would these structures fare if we were hit with a magnitude 7.0 earthquake? I was in Antigua last month when it was shaken by a magnitude 6.2 earthquake. I was in my hotel room at the time, and I felt the vibration. slight at first, but after about 5 seconds, the whole room started shaking and the heavy glass doors that lead out to the balcony were rattling like crazy. It was scary. And that was 6.2. How would we make out in Jamaica if a major earthquake were to hit us? There are 4 generations of us that have not experienced anything like this. I doubt if there's anyone alive today who experienced the 1907 earthquake, because there would have to be 100 and plenty to have been around at that time. What is the state of our buildings and infrastructure? Are our building requirements adequate for our vulnerable circumstances? And importantly, are they being enforced? What is our response capability? We saw where in Turkey some survivors were being pulled from under the rubble of concrete and steel, even up to 10 days after the earthquake struck. How they managed to stay alive without food and water for 10 days is not just a miracle. It has to be God's blessing. Would we be able to pull people from under a rubble of concrete and steel? Do we have the equipment to do that? Do we have the training? Because we certainly don't have the experience, and if it is not done with expertise, it can cause further collapse and further loss of lives. What systems are in place to go into action within minutes of an earthquake to minimize the loss of life and to provide emergency care to those who may be injured? January each year is observed as Earthquake Awareness Month, and various programs are conducted to educate people, to sensitize them about the possibility of an earthquake, and to highlight the things that we need to do before it happens if we are to minimize its effects, and what we should do if it does happen. But how many of us bother to pay any mind, pay any attention to these programs? Have we become complacent because we have been spared for such a long time? Do we need to rouse ourselves and prepare ourselves for the worst, even as we continue to hope for the best and pray that God continues to bless us? You know, the Bible declares that faith without work is dead. How much work have we put in to prepare ourselves for a major earthquake so that we can mitigate some of the devastation and loss of lives that might otherwise occur? What does our report card look like? That's what we're talking about today. That's our topic for today. Jamaica's earthquake susceptibility, our vulnerability, our level of preparedness, and the extent of our resilience. It's an important topic, and we're going to dive into it when we come back. Welcome back. It's Jamaica Live. We're on Bridge 99. Today we're talking about Jamaica's circumstances as it relates to the possibility of an earthquake. We want to talk about our susceptibility because we are susceptible. We want to talk about our level of preparedness. We want to look at how resilient we're likely to be. And we're very pleased to welcome to the discussion, to start off the discussion, Professor Anthony Clayton, who is Professor of Caribbean Sustainable Development at the University of the West Indies. Professor Clayton, welcome to the program.
Thank you. Good morning, Mr. Golding.
Yes. Tell me, we haven't had a major earthquake in over 100 years.
That's right.
We've been lucky, we've been blessed. And because of that, perhaps we have become complacent. If we were to be hit with an earthquake of the magnitude of what hit Turkey earlier this month, how would we fare?
I suspect not very well. We've got recent projections showing the likelihood of an earthquake, and it's not, unfortunately, it's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when. We have one assessment from a few years ago saying that we've probably got enough elastic strain accumulated in the fault line that runs under Jamaica, the Lyew-Ayee planting garden fault line, to generate something in the order of a 7 to 7.5 magnitude earthquake, which is roughly the same magnitude as the one that hit Turkey and Syria 3 weeks ago. That earthquake led to 48,000 deaths, the collapse of 173,000 buildings, and they now have about 530,000 people living in tents. I don't think it would be quite as bad as that, because we probably have more steel in our buildings. But the real problem in Turkey was, in fact, corruption, because what we now know is that most of the buildings that collapsed, in theory, met the building codes, and Turkey has very strict building codes. But the problem was non-compliance and corruption. In many cases, the building inspectors were simply bribed to look the other way. They also had this very strange arrangement in Turkey.
We're not immune. We're not immune to that here.
No, we're definitely not. No, we're definitely not. Now, the problem is that we don't have effective a system of building inspectors. If you put up a building in other jurisdictions like the US or the UK, you're going to get inspected at a number of points during the construction of the building. And this is to ensure that the foundations are as deep as they're supposed to be, that there's enough steel, that there's cross-bracing, and so on. Now, in a situation where we have developments going up with quite often no building inspection or very little, then we simply don't know. We don't know how many of these buildings are going to come down. So we could be in a situation which is actually quite similar to that of Turkey.
I don't know how familiar you are with our building code requirements, particularly the revised building code. But can you say, if a high-rise building, we're told that a 27-story building is to start shortly on Oxford Road.
Right.
If a building of that kind of height, or even less, were to be built and was to meet all of the building code requirements, could that withstand a 7.8 earthquake?
In principle, yes. They have very tall buildings in Japan, which are engineered to withstand the strongest earthquakes. In Japan, however, you have a very strict system of regulation and enforcement to ensure that the buildings really do meet the code. Now, I suspect that the new buildings that have been proposed for Kingston are probably going to be reasonably well engineered. I think that the problem is going to lie in a lot of the buildings because, as you know, we have a quarter of our population living in the informal settlements, and those buildings were not built to code. A lot of them, I suspect, may collapse if they get if we get a big enough earthquake. And if we get a 7 to 7.5 magnitude earthquake, a lot of them will come down, and the people inside will be crushed.
And I imagine those people, and we have a lot of them who live on gully banks.
Well, that's the other problem. Yes, because they are in some cases on unstable slopes.
Those banks may disappear.
Yes, they can. And even within the city, if you stand on the Lyew-Ayee plain and look up towards, for example, the hills that surround the city, and you see patches where the ground is noticeably greener, that's actually a fairly recent landslip. And we've built on landslips, which means that if we have a bad earthquake, especially if it follows, say, 2-3 days of rain, that a lot of that ground is going to come down, and the houses that are built on it are also going to slide.
What is our response capability like in the event that an earthquake was to strike? Because it's not going to give us any notice. It's going to hit us.
Mm-hmm.
What is our capacity to jump into action right away, to try and mitigate loss of life and so on?
Very few countries have got the capacity to respond to a major earthquake, a really big earthquake. There are ways that we could improve our ability to respond. The important thing to remember is that if you have a big earthquake, about 90% of the people who are dug out from the wreckage are dug out by their neighbors, because people tend not to survive very long underneath a collapsed building. You either get them out within the first few hours, or the chances of survival go down rapidly. So by the time the professionals can get there, most people have already died. So the way that we could improve our capacity to respond is actually by doing earthquake training, and by making sure that there's networks of depots throughout the island where we have things like emergency supplies, shovels, emergency medical supplies, and so forth. And of course, the other thing we must do is we must stop development on unstable slopes, because that's a recipe for disaster.
You mentioned earlier, Professor Clayton, when we started the discussion, the likelihood, in other words, it's almost as if you were saying we are running out of time in terms of the odds.
I'm afraid that's true.
Tell me, what I wanted to ask you though, ask you is whether or not modern technology is capable of looking beneath the Earth's surface to see exactly what is the condition of the plates on which we sit, and whether or not we're more likely to slip now than we were, say, 10 years ago.
You can, to some extent, do that. We do know, for example, that there's a fault line that runs pretty much underneath Jamaica end to end. That's the biggest one, but there's other fault lines running north to south. And we understand which way the plates underneath us are moving. We can't predict, we don't have the technology or the ability to be able to give you an exact date. But we can look at things like early warning signs of movement on the plate. The big 2010 earthquake that affected Port-au-Prince in Haiti, that was the same fault line that Jamaica sits on. And because that section of the line has moved, it means that the strain on the remaining section of the line, including the section that runs under Jamaica, is now probably somewhat greater, which is why we think that it's probably, we're more likely to have an earthquake. It's probably not going to take another 100 years, put it that way. I suspect we'll have an earthquake well within that time.
You're frightening me.
I'm sorry, but this is just the fact of the matter.
I may not be around, but I have 6 grandchildren. Tell me, what causes the plates to move? Is it anything we are doing above ground?
No, these are the deep plates, the tectonic plates. The whole world, the little bit that we know is only a few miles thick, and that sits on top of enormous plates of rock, which sits on top of molten rock, which is why they're in constant motion, but they move relatively slowly, which is why we don't get earthquakes every day. So there's nothing we can do about that. It's in the nature of the planet on which we live.
But there's more that we can do in terms of trying to mitigate the damage that can result, no?
Absolutely. That's where we have to focus. The natural disasters, they're only disasters because we're not prepared for them. Natural disasters are really just natural events. What makes them disasters is if we allow people to build in the wrong place, if we don't insist on people building to code, and if people don't know what to do when there is an earthquake. That's what really results in the mass casualties. And in Turkey and Syria, what we've seen is the impact of pervasive corruption at all levels, which has resulted in these buildings going up without proper earthquake protection.
Well,
even though it's specified in the building code.
Well, I saw a video, and I mentioned it in my opening. I saw a video of the Turkish president campaigning in the 2019 election.
Right.
And he was boasting about how many housing developments had taken place under his watch, because they had granted waivers to developers from complying with some of the building requirements.
That's exactly what they did. They actually allowed developers who had bypassed all of the building codes. They'd put up buildings which were not in compliance, and then they gave them retroactive approval in return for a generous donation and fee from the developers.
Tell me.
So they were actually licensing criminality for money. That's the most pervasive form of corruption you could imagine. But it was very popular because people thought they were getting decent houses. And of course, it was generating a lot of money for corrupt officials at all levels. But the cost, as we've seen today, is 48,000 people killed. Some people think that corruption is a victimless crime. It's not. It just killed 48,000 people.
Professor Clayton, can you spend a little more time with me? I have Peter Jervis I want to bring in. He's a civil engineer. I want to bring him in to get his perspective. Can you stay with me?
Sure.
And we hope to bring on Mr. Peter Jervis. He's a civil engineer with years of experience in Jamaica. Do we have him on? Peter? Peter?
Hello.
How are you doing, Peter?
Fine, thank you, man.
I have Professor Anthony Clayton on the program as well.
Yes,
of
course.
And he was making the point, and it's a very valid point, that we can't prevent an earthquake. There's nothing that we do that causes it. And there's nothing we can do to prevent it. What we have to do is to focus on what can we do to minimize the damage that is done. And he is very concerned that there's the likelihood of many structures, some of them perhaps high-rise structures out there, that have been built and have short-circuited the building requirements. How exposed are we? You've been on the ground for a long time. How exposed are we to buildings that could collapse because of shortcuts that were taken?
Okay, we can be vulnerable. But what I've seen in the last few years is a sort of an institutional strengthening in local government. They are taking more scrutiny on building applications, and I am aware of fairly consistent inspections during construction. Now, these are, I suppose, the projects with which I am familiar. So I'm not unhappy with the improvements that are taking place in our local government management. Our vulnerability, there's very little we can do with our old building stock. Anything pre-1950, I wouldn't rely on them to perform, even with retrofit, very well. We tend to loosely use the word high-rise. There are tiers of what we call building categories. Up to 8-10 floors is normal, sort of medium rise. Up to 20 is the official medium rise. Above 20 now you're getting into high rise, tall buildings.
And we have one coming on Oxford Road, I'm told.
I'm aware of it.
Yes.
The normal course prescribed by the U.S. Code, well, the IBC, which is what we are now tying our building codes to, requires a peer review of any design of anything over 5 floors. Now, I know that doesn't really happen because I really haven't been peer reviewed very much or asked to peer review other than a few new buildings. So that exchange of scrutiny will help with, certainly seismic design and hurricane and these things. So the systems are cranking up for management. But again, as your other guest said, untitled lands are completely vulnerable because the builder on an untitled bit of land will not do anything too expensive. So
we seem to. I find myself instinctively being concerned about high rise, whether we're talking about 5 floors or 15 floors.
Okay.
But Professor Clayton was making the point earlier that you don't have to be high rise to suffer serious damage.
Of course, I agree with that totally, and that's where we are most vulnerable. The medium rise, because a lot of them are not necessarily engineered.
But even single-story buildings, if they're not constructed properly, they could collapse, couldn't they, Professor Clayton?
Yes, that's quite right. And can I just say that I think that Peter's absolutely right. A lot of the problem, I think, will be concentrated in the informal build, because I think a lot of those buildings were not built to code. Well, obviously they weren't built to code at all. They're illegal. And the other section where I think we've got a problem is, although I agree standards have been tightened up recently, our housing stock turns over at probably something like 1 or 2% per annum, which means that it's going to take very many years before any change, significant tightening of the building codes.
In terms of replacing them?
In terms of replacing the older buildings, which would not meet current day code. And then I think a lot of those are probably vulnerable, yes.
Now, let me ask a question. Perhaps I should put this question to Peter. Let us say I live in a single-story house that was built 40, 50 years ago. And Professor Clayton frightens the daylight out of me when he says that, look, it's not 100 more years to go and wait for one. One is going to come much earlier than that. And I were to decide, well, let me see what I can do to reinforce the one single-story house that I have. Is that engineeringly possible?
It is. Yeah, we can retrofit by putting in more walls, more solid walls. A lot of the time, we take out walls, to create bigger spaces. It may be a good idea to put them back. Our domestic building in the last 20 years, because of the direction of the large-scale housing developers, are poured concrete. Those are intrinsically good, sound. The trouble begins when you start adding on upstairs.
When the foundation wasn't designed for that.
And the lower walls, because what happens is that ground motion is transferred up to capture and move the rest of the building. And if you don't have walls to do that, that's it. You have failure. So you can retrofit with walls, with more port walls or X-bracing, but that may not look so nice. But there are ways to stiffen up a building.
But that's probably an expensive undertaking, no?
It need not be. It need not be. It can be carefully and sort of precisely done, so you're not just doing a lot of stuff that costs too much.
Are we doing enough in terms of the government and the respective agencies? Are we doing enough to sensitize people to the possibility and the consequences of an earthquake? Or is it that they are talking and preaching, but people just not paying them any mind?
The media, look, the more we see of what happened in Turkey, the more people become sensitive. That's some terrifying images. I mean, I went to Haiti soon after their big one, so I know, no one will make a mistake in Haiti again. and I guess so too with Turkey. But we are seeing these images. Well, we are coming out with a sort of a builder's manual.
And I'm sure you're right on that, because this morning I was watching one of the news channels, and the engineering fraternity in Turkey is criticizing the government because they're about to start building, or rebuilding, or reconstruction. Mm-hmm. And they're apparently not really paying much attention to the kind of requirements that those buildings need. Let me ask you, Professor Clayton, what is the status of our public infrastructure? If we were to have a bad earthquake, are our bridges likely to collapse?
Oh, I think that's more a question for Peter than for myself.
Peter?
Yes. Our bridges, I wouldn't be too concerned. The older ones, pre-1950, technology kind of took a nice turn in the 60s. where things got more seismic conscious in their designs. Culverts, land movement will remove, bridges and roads, and that's where we are a little frail. We have a lot of remote locations that will be cut off thoroughly because our land is just plain not stable in many areas. And that will take the road and the bridge and the water main and the GPS power line all at once. So that's my unease, really.
What do we do, Peter, with those areas? For example, I know above where I live, houses are going up fast, rapid.
Yes.
And I happen to know that a lot of that, of those sites where the houses are being built, they're sitting on shale.
And old landslide material.
Yeah, Professor Clayton had made that point as well. Now, how secure are those?
Well, I guess if they're properly engineered, a lot of piling has been done, of those that I'm aware. A lot have been sort of founded on bedrock. A lot are just sort of hanging loose on the rubble. But again, those may be the informal ones.
If I could just add something to that last point. When you're thinking about your risk, one of the things obviously you have to think about is construction, but you also have to think about the soil type and the slope. All of these are also going to affect your total risk. One of the things that we noticed with the 2010 earthquake in Haiti is a lot of the buildings that went down, because the soil partially liquefied when it was being vibrated, the buildings were getting lateral twists, and that's where you really need cross bracing. A lot of them didn't have it. They didn't really have much steel, and that's why they just pancaked on top of the people living in them. And this apparently is true in earthquake of Turkey as well, that they economized on the bits of the building that you don't see, like the structural steel and the cross bracing, which is again why a lot of them, you saw floors just simply coming down on top of each other. So one of the things that we could do to look at our risk is, first of all, we could actually look at our planning system and try and steer development away from areas where we think there's going to be geological issues which would increase the risk, or else specify that anything built in particular areas has to be engineered to a higher standard. That would do something to reduce the total number of lives lost. Of course, that's really for the future. That isn't going to do very much about addressing the problem as it is now.
Let us say we were hit with a 7.4 magnitude earthquake. Some buildings are almost certain to collapse.
Yes.
People are almost certain to die. Let us say that a building collapses and you hear screams from under the rubble. Do we have the capability, do we have the expertise to be able to try and rescue those people who are still alive but, stuck under tons of concrete?
Well, as I mentioned earlier, most of the people who are rescued after an earthquake are actually rescued by their neighbors, because you have to get people out fairly quickly. Once they've been under the rubble for a while, you tend not to get very many out alive.
Yeah, but we saw in Turkey where people were being pulled out even up to 10 days after. I don't know how they survived that length of time.
Yes, but that's rare. Most of the people who survive are the ones who are rescued fairly quickly. So we really need to have a devolved system of responding to earthquakes. You can't rely on having a few teams around the place, because if it's a big earthquake, there's simply too many places where they would have to be at the same time. So a devolved system with local volunteers trained with depots, with equipment, would probably do quite a lot to reduce the number of unnecessary fatalities.
Have we done anything like that?
I don't believe so, no.
I know that we have done some hurricane response training, but I don't know that we ever really focused on earthquakes.
The removal of rubble in a delicate way is foreign to us. We really don't have that focus or concentration. Much like the ODPEM set up to have equipment to clear roads, to some extent those equipment could, with slings, start the removal of boulders and slabs. But that's...
But it requires expertise.
Yes. Yes,
because you're trying to lift them off carefully and delicately to avoid crushing the people underneath who might still be alive underneath.
Yes.
As long as the airport is in good shape, those skills generally try to fly in immediately, as we saw,
Yes.
Well, that is, Peter's absolutely right. But of course, by the time you get teams in country, 24 hours later,
many people would have succumbed.
A lot of people would have succumbed by then, yes.
Yes. Tell me, is there any section of Jamaica? Jamaica is so small and we're sitting on the fault line, but is there any section of Jamaica that is more vulnerable than others?
Yes, there are hazard maps showing which parts of Jamaica are more vulnerable than others. There's hazard maps for landslide, for earthquake, for flooding, etc. And if you want to decide where your next house should be, you could check out those hazard maps.
What kind of tsunami could a 7.3 earthquake in Jamaica create?
Oh, if it was under the sea. You mean if the earthquake lifted the seabed, like the tsunami in Japan, for example?
Yes.
It would depend where it was, how far away it was, and it depends on other local factors like the slope of the seabed coming up to the shore. There is no single answer to that.
Because more than half of our population live on the coast, no?
Yes, most of our main centers of population. That's right.
And our vulnerability is not just confined to the south coast. I believe the north coast as well could be affected, no?
Depending where the tsunami was, where the earthquake was and where the tsunami came in, yes.
What is the normal time span between an earthquake strike and the tsunami?
It depends entirely on how far away it is. If it's close, it could be minutes. If it's far away, it could be many hours. If, for example, there's a potential problem in the Canary Islands, where there are some scenarios that show a mountain falling into the sea, the wave might take something like 8 hours to reach us. So it depends very much where it is. Again, what we can do to reduce the risk is to help to build out a network of seabed sensors. Some of that is already in place, so that you get as much advance warning as possible. And to make sure that there's a system.
How much advance warning would that be?
Well, again, it depends where the tsunami is, where the earthquake was, where the epicenter was.
Yes.
But if you can give any warning you can give, provided that people know what to do, is going to save lives.
Yeah. Does the technology exist, Professor Clayton, where we can measure movements in the tectonic plate to sort of alert us to say, hey, something funny is happening?
Well, usually you get some advance warning in terms of tremors and movement. And if you get a movement elsewhere along a fault line, which is, in fact, as we were saying, what happened in the 2010 earthquake in Haiti, then you know that, first of all, it's an active fault. And second, it suggests that the elastic strain, the deformation in the rest of the fault is now higher, which is why we think that we're maybe a bit too close to comfort for a big earthquake in Jamaica, because we're actually sitting on top of an active fault line, what's called a slipstick fault. One side is moving one direction, the other side's moving in the other direction.
And those movements are measurable?
We unfortunately, we don't have the ability to actually go down and take a look. but you can tell quite a lot from activity on the surface. In terms of, you can make some conclusions as to what might be happening underneath.
How deep is that fault line that we're sitting on?
Oh, I'm not sure. I'd have to check that for you. But the plates are miles below the surface.
Yes.
Far below the level at which we can drill.
And that would be below the seabed, no?
Oh yes. At this point, yes, it would be.
Well, at least I'm encouraged, Peter, with the report that you have given, that we seem to be taking a more aggressive approach now in terms of building requirements. I'm pleased to hear that. I hope that is so.
Mm-hmm. Yes. The plates, just to jump back, the plates are mostly 80, 100, 120 miles down. Yes. So you can't, we don't have any technology that would enable us to go drill anything like as deep as that to actually find out. But of course we can model what's going on, and then we can validate the model in terms of actual behavior, and gradually over time get a better and better understanding. But we can't, we can't actually do anything about stopping this. But what we can do is get better at planning and preparation.
Yes.
And it's worth remembering that in Turkey, the big earthquake that just killed 48,000 people, there was one town right in the middle of the earthquake zone called Erzurum, where not one building came down and not one person was killed.
How do you explain that?
Well, the difference is that they have had two mayors in succession who enforced building codes to the letter. They did not tolerate any corruption. And in that town, Erzurum, right in the middle of the biggest earthquake, not one building came down. So simply by cleaning up corruption,
yes,
by ensuring proper planning, proper building regulation, you can save many lives.
Yes, interesting. Is Cuba also at risk?
Yes, it is. They're in an active earthquake zone too.
Let me say that Turkey is deep in seismic design, because in 1980, my professor in seismic was from Turkey.
Yep, they do know what to do. Enforcement and corruption is a big problem there.
Yes. And then the other point you make about really getting an active program to sensitize communities. And I believe one of the things that I tried to do when I was in office, was to use the Cadet Corps in the various schools where they existed, because they certainly didn't exist to the extent that they did when I was at school. But to train the members of the Cadet Corps in terms of hurricane response. But we really need to do some work now in terms of an earthquake response, because that's a completely different set of things that you have to prepare people for.
But that's a great idea, something like a cadet corps,
yes,
because you can train them in many things, like, for example, what to do in a hurricane, what to do in an earthquake.
Yes.
And even when they're grown and moved on, they'll remember those skills.
Yes.
And over time, you'll build a group of people in the population who know what to do, which is an incredibly valuable resource.
Well, I remember I started the program with the Cadet Corps at St. Mary High School, but I left office shortly afterwards. I don't know if it was continued, but it's something I think we need to look at.
One of the things that's always plagued us is the fact that good programs are started and then there's a change of government and the programs just stop.
Yeah, well,
we're not good at continuity.
Yeah. Gentlemen, I want to thank both of you, Professor Anthony Clayton, who is Professor of Caribbean Sustainable Development, and Mr. Peter Jervis, a civil engineer of many, many years, distinguished civil engineer in Jamaica. Thank you both for joining me today.
Thank you, Mr. Golding. Thank you, Mr. Jarvis. Bye-bye.
A pleasure.
We'll take a break. Welcome back. It's Jamaica Live. We're on Bridge 99, coming to you from Kingston, Jamaica. We hope to link with Beauregard in New York at Harry Jam as soon as he's through with some housekeeping matters that he has to deal with up there. Today we're talking about Jamaica's earthquake vulnerability. And we wanted to look not just at our vulnerability, because that's a matter of fact. We can't change that. As those of you who have been listening from we started the discussion would have heard that we sit on an earthquake fault line. The earth rests on plates of rock, and we happen to be sitting on two plates. That one is kind of curved on top of another. And over time, the plates move. And when the plates move, then everything above it shakes. And if it moves seriously, if it moves significantly, then you have a major earthquake. If it just budges a little bit, then you get a little tremor. And we have had tremors in Jamaica. From time to time, people say, you felt the earthquake this morning. A little 3-point-something magnitude earthquake that don't really, it scares some people. It caused the chandelier to start swinging, but it doesn't create no damage. When those plates move violently to a great extent, then it creates hell and powder house above the ground, and buildings collapse and so on, as we've seen happen in Turkey. So we've been lucky. We haven't had any major earthquake in Jamaica for over 100 years. The last major earthquake we had was 1907. That's before any of us, I think, were born. I don't think anybody who was alive in 1907 is still alive today. They would have to be 16 years old. You may have a few. But poor them probably too old now to even remember it. So that's what we're talking about today. And we're pleased to be joined now by Dr. Parris Lyew-Ayee, Jr., who is the former executive director of the Mona Geoinformatics Institute. Parris, welcome to the program.
Afternoon.
How have you been?
I'm good.
When I was talking to Professor Clayton, who you know well, I'm sure, earlier,
Yeah.
he said that it's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when we get a major earthquake.
Yeah.
That sounds frightening. Should I be frightened?
Well, no. Do you live in a properly constructed house?
I think so.
Yeah, you're okay.
But I know many people who don't.
It's about, exactly. That is where we need to be concerned. Just a little short correction. Jamaica is actually on just one plate, the Caribbean plate.
Yes.
It is near a plate boundary between the Caribbean plate and the North American plate, which is between us and Cuba.
Yes.
But Jamaica itself, as an island, isn't on a plate boundary. It's near a plate boundary.
Okay, but if you have movement between those two plates, we will feel it.
All plates are always moving.
Mm-hmm.
It is along with pressure. Along a certain type of plate boundary, certain types of conditions happening. But again, you're talking about the inevitability of an earthquake, and that is absolutely correct.
I was asking Professor Clayton, I want to put the question to you as well.
Yeah.
Has the technology developed sufficiently with the availability of satellites and things that can penetrate all kind of material? Has the technology developed significantly so that you would be able to say now, 5 years ago, this was the relationship between the two plates, but there has been some movement and this is what the plates look like now.
Yes.
So that if one is about to slip off the other, we will at least be able to prepare ourselves. Are we there?
Yeah, there are many different ways. In short, yes. What you do is normal movements. You look at things like microquakes and all those other things that can predict a big one. Sometimes you do want the smaller tremors that you were alluding to in your introductions, that would release the pressure. Otherwise, you'd have a much more sudden release of energy, which is more destructive.
And are we able to measure those movements?
Yes, we do. We can at millimeter scales. But it doesn't necessarily say that, unlike a hurricane where you can actually predict days in advance and so on, we're talking about the inevitability of an earthquake event. We have no idea, right? Not impossible.
Uh-huh.
you do look at microquakes.
You're breaking, Parris, you're breaking up on me, and I'm not hearing you.
I'm not even moving. Hang on. Is this better?
Yeah, that's a little better, yes.
Yeah. So if there are microquakes, tremors, those types of things that can indicate some kind of activity or increase in activity, you also look at the probability looking at historical record. Places have a lot more earthquake frequency than Jamaica. The Pacific Ring of Fire is a very good example of that. Japan is very advanced in that. You also have other things like tsunami warning systems that can detect motion at the seafloor. That would also tell you certain types of activities are possible. Where the technology has actually really developed is in engineering things to allow for the survivability of an earthquake.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm sure you're going to ask that question later.
Well, walk us through some of those.
So, for example, when we know what is possible, we're able to design those types of mitigation features. So, for example, earthquake-resistant buildings, construction types, even things like earthquake evacuation drills and procedures, emergency response systems. These are different in areas that have different types of exposures. So, for example, Japan is also extremely experienced at these types of engineering and other types of procedures that would help the earthquake response and survivability. You can't stop the earthquake. You just prepare for it.
The problem, though, Parris, as Anthony Clayton was pointing out, is one thing to have that in place. Is another thing to make sure you enforce them.
Absolutely, and that is where the human side of things begin to become paramount. We do have in Jamaica, or we need to enforce in a lot more rigor, and I'm sure Dr. Green will mention this when you bring her on.
Matter of fact, I'd love to bring her on now, because I'd love to have both of you. Pat, are you there?
Yes, I am. Good afternoon,
hi, Pat.
guys. Good afternoon, Prime Minister. How are you?
I'm good. Tell me, Parris, are we as vulnerable as Japan?
No, definitely not. Japan is along the Ring of Fire. Tokyo, in particular, one of the world's largest cities, is also in the shadow of Mount Fuji, which is an active volcano. So you do have seismic risks, mega cities being built along the Ring of Fire in the shadow of a volcano that are eminently survivable.
Are we as vulnerable as California?
Who is vulnerable? Jamaica?
Uh-huh.
No, we're not. San Andreas Fault is a different type of exposure. So again, Jamaica doesn't have the same type of exposure. But if you want to see what's possible in Jamaica, you look at Haiti. Yes. Haiti, the fault line, the Enriquez Plantain Garden fault that affected Haiti originated at its western extent in Jamaica. It's along the same fault line that goes all the way to Puerto Rico. Yes. So you have to look at the fact that that's possible. But mind you, the Haiti earthquake was magnitude 7. The Port Royal earthquake in 1692 was magnitude 7.6, right? So and the 1907 earthquake that you mentioned earlier in your broadcast
6.2,
6.5.
Right?
So again, we're able to see what kind of energies are possible with these types of earthquake events.
But
it all redounds to the construction and the behavior of the people beneath that, both from the government point of view as well as general construction and the population as a whole.
But tell me, isn't Dam Rep on that same fault line?
Correct.
But I can't recall any earthquake in Dam Rep. Is it that they have been as lucky as we are?
No, well, Dominican Republic felt the earthquake in 2011. They felt it, but it doesn't mean that they would experience the same type of destruction. Yes. Again, that's a function of luck. The epicenter was in Haiti, yes. Right?
But also a function of what you have done above ground.
Precisely, from a human point of view. Human being, engineering, regulations, just general practice, education, all of the above. Nothing to do with nature, but everything to do with everything else.
Well, Pat, tell me, if so much turns on what we have done above ground, how sloppy have we been?
Oh my goodness, what a question. Well, it's very important for us to understand that there are earthquake mitigation strategies. And so if we can be found wanting or sloppy, if we don't adhere to, if we don't set these things up And if we don't ensure that, well, this is the adherence, enforcement is carried out. For instance, I want to really give a huge big up to our Africans who were enslaved. When the 1692 earthquake took place in Port Royal, the brick buildings were destroyed. And it's important for us to recognize that earthquakes do not necessarily harm people. We do know of Louis Gaudi who was swallowed up and spat out. But it's the buildings that are destroyed that does most damage to property and especially lives. And therefore it is our responsibility to develop mitigation strategies to prevent death and injury. So technically I have highlighted about 4 critical issues in terms of mitigation strategies. One I would just call very quickly citing, another is resilience, another is the material, and the other 4th is enforcement. Prime Minister, you can prompt me as we go along.
Well,
so
first of all, Pat, you need to forgive me because I didn't introduce you properly. Dr. Patricia Green, who is a registered professional architect. She's a conservationist. Somebody who I used to work with when I was Minister of Construction, and somebody who I have so much regard for in terms of her passion for Jamaica and Jamaica's architecture and Jamaica's, the landscape of Jamaica and how we need to preserve it. So welcome to the program. And go on, because I interrupted you.
Thank you so much, Minister. Well, Prime Minister. Thank you. Thank you for that introduction. What I wanted to point out is that location is the key thing, and Parris can reinforce this. In Port Royal, when the English came in 1665, let's go back, the Spanish were told by the Taínos that Port Royal was an unsuitable place for construction and settlement. Right. And when the English came, they said the same. Many people don't even realize that Port Royal never had running water. So they drank rum. So when you hear those stories of Port Royal, it's because that's how they had their liquid. It was rum. And so they used to bring water from Kingston to Port Royal. So they said it was an unsuitable place for settlement. But yet the English built a city there. And in 31 years, it was destroyed by an earthquake. 2/3 of the city sank in the sea. And what happened in Port Royal, it is reported in the history of the documentation, that the English ejected the Africans out of their what's called humble stick houses. And they lived in them until they were able to rebuild the city. Because construction technology, this is what we're talking about, the resilience of the construction.
Is there any part of Jamaica today, Pat and Parris, that is as risky and vulnerable as Port Royal was then?
I would allow Parris to answer that.
Certainly, in terms of the vulnerability to liquefaction and subsidence, ground motion, pretty much all of the Ligonier Plain and Portmore are areas of concern. Given the levels of development in those areas.
What are you saying to me? Portmore? Portmore?
Portmore has never been tested, and that is why I'm kind of holding my breath when I say that. But the reality is that the ground conditions of Portmore, we're talking about consolidated or unconsolidated sediment upon which settlement has been built upon. It is not that indifferent. Port Royal is a little bit different because it's along the Palisadoes Tombolo. It has a different, let's say, origin than the Ligonier Plain and Portmore. Portmore is also an engineered reclamation as well. So it has a different type of land suitability. It's still a mix of unconsolidated and consolidated sediment. And if you were in the hills. Now what happens is that earthquake waves move differently in sediment than they do in solid rock, bedrock. And that is why you'd have a different type of ground acceleration in Kingston, Portmore, and Portmore.
Let me ask you this, Pat. Again, I'm sort of moving on from the discussion I had with Professor Clayton and Peter Jervis. Let us say an earthquake 7.0 and above were to hit us. My instinct tells me I'm instantly going to be concerned about the high-rise structures, but all structures can be affected, no?
Yeah, yeah.
Do you know whether anywhere in our system we have done any kind of auditing of our vulnerable buildings? Are we satisfied, for example, that the 17 floors at the Pegasus can withstand a 7.0 earthquake? Are we satisfied that the Bank of Jamaica building can withstand that? Do you know whether or not we have done any of that sort of auditing?
I would say specific to earthquake, no. And this is why I would like to support and call for an audit of buildings. It is particularly important because we are talking about location and siting. It's not just the liquefaction. We also have some sections of Jamaica, certain hillsides and certain areas which move, geologically. Parris can explain that. So therefore, it is less suited for construction than others. Now, when you speak about those two buildings, we do recognize that those buildings were done by professional teams, that we have professional architects who worked on them, and they had professional engineering. And putting in those structures, there was a lot of exchange of technology, and we have drawings and documentation and seismic surveys and engineering
geotechnical work,
soil, all kind of geotechnical soil analysis. That's a prerequisite from any construction project. So we as architects would invite our engineers. We are given a project. We have our soil technicians. The first thing we do. I am amazed that buildings are going up now, Prime Minister, when people are saying, oh my God, it's flooding. I cannot believe these things are happening. You should have done your geotechnical before you started putting up a construction and advise the client it is an unsuitable place.
But Parris, I mean, right now, there are some sections of St. Andrew that I drive through and I see 5-6-story apartment complexes. Are the authorities satisfied that those are earthquake proof?
That's why we need an audit.
Right.
First of all, we have to find out who is the construction team and were the necessary examinations undertaken prior to including structural engineer. Mr. Jervis can reinforce that. Who is the structural engineer? Some of these buildings may not have been done by a professional team, and that's why the audit is necessary.
Absolutely, and they don't vary from the approved designs, and that is something that we have seen, proliferating in the last few years. One of the things I just want to mention at this juncture is the fact that, even in Jamaica we have squatters building with block and steel. It's a little different than in Haiti, where we see a lot of the buildings pancaking, and we see very flimsy structures down at a breeze blow and everything collapses. That said, it doesn't necessarily mean that they're invulnerable. Block and steel does not guarantee that your house will not be damaged in an earthquake. But it is the whole that is important, not just the individual building, but all buildings have to be considered together.
Can I ask you both to just pause for a moment? New York is listening to us, but I haven't really brought them into the discussion. Beauregard, where are you?
Good afternoon, Mr. Golden.
How are you doing?
I'm doing great, sir.
We're talking about something today that don't concern you because you don't have an earthquake in New York.
Of course, we a couple of weeks ago we had a 3.8 magnitude in
New York,
in Buffalo. Yes.
Is that right? I didn't know that.
Yes.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
How are you doing, Bo?
I'm doing great, sir.
What's the weather like up there?
It's around 45 degrees today, sir.
And you will call that warm?
Yeah, that nice today.
You go away.
Definitely enjoying the conversation.
If we have 45-degree temperature in Jamaica, the whole country shut down.
I hear that, sir.
But it's nice to hear you, Bo.
Also nice to hear you.
I'm watching all the exciting things taking place in the US, but you and I will talk about that another time.
All right,
We're talking about earthquake today because them people frightening the hell out of me, Them saying, look, it's not a matter of if, it's when. Mm-hmm. And that when could be tomorrow or next week.
Yep.
And what we want to focus on is how prepared are we? How resilient would we be? I certainly wouldn't want to see pictures of what happened in Turkey happening in Jamaica. So we're talking with the experts to try and get a sense of where we are in terms of our mitigation and our planning.
We're listening on this side, sir.
Yeah, Pat and Parris.
Yeah.
If somebody tried to entice me to buy a penthouse apartment, I don't know, after listening to you, I would have tell them thank you, but no thanks. Give me one that sit down on the ground.
No, you see, one of the things you would look at when you're getting your penthouse apartment is to make sure that it's a properly designed building, approved by the authorities, executed according to plan, etc. Credible, accredited architects and engineers and so on. All of those things are important. When we understand what is possible, then we can begin to design a solution that's appropriate.
Now tell me, hold on, Parris. Pat, you jump in on this one for me. What would prevent a 27-story building? Because we're told that one is coming up on Oxford Road. What kind of design, engineering would prevent that building from coming down if you have a 7.8 earthquake?
Well, thank you for introducing that subject, Prime Minister, because buildings like that in any kind of environment, in any civilized society, and Jamaica is supposed to be one, we are one, you would have a public consultation. So we would have everybody sitting around the table, and it could be on Zoom where the entire nation is involved, and people ask the question, show us your engineering solution. Yep. Show us what you have done to mitigate, and we're talking about mitigation strategies. It's very simple. They have these buildings in Japan. When the earthquake comes, the buildings move and fall back in place.
So Parris, tell me, is it possible to earthquake-proof a 27-story building?
If they have earthquake-proof 101-story building in Taipei right now, and that is a far more seismically active region than Jamaica, far more seismically active. And but again, the design specifications for something to resist that kind of earthquake movement does introduce significant costs, and that is the element here. You can do anything with engineering, but it boils down to the economics, right? So you have the environment, engineering, and economics of any project, the 3 E's of any type of project development. Because the fact is, I mentioned Tokyo earlier, but Mexico City, again, one of the largest cities in the world, is underneath an active volcano, that's Popocatépetl, and it's on the same ring of fire as Tokyo. You do have Jakarta, you do have Manila, all of these mega cities. You mentioned California, so LA, San Francisco, Seattle, Vancouver, all of those places are on the ring of fire. And Chile, exactly. Chile had a 9.5 earthquake about 10 years ago. Again, you're not seeing the kinds of scenes you see in Turkey or Haiti or these types of places. In Japan in 2012, precisely. So
the
it's really about
strategy is in place, and that is very, very important, Prime Minister. What Parris is talking about are countries that put mitigation strategies in place. Now, we as the general public, we need to know what is going in and what have the developers or promoters of this particular 27-story building or even a 4-story building. We need to know what is inside it and how they have mitigated.
You cannot build a story building the same way you would build a 5-story building. That's the given. And everything else will radiate away from that basic tenet.
Professor Clayton was making the point, and I think it's a valid point, that if an earthquake were to strike, much of the successful response is going to have to be within a matter of minutes or hours.
Yeah.
And there is no kind of official first responders that's going to be able to do that. A lot will depend on people who are on the ground, neighbors. Are our people, have we made enough effort to sensitize our people, A, to the likelihood of an earthquake, and B, if an earthquake happens, these are the things that you need to jump into right away.
Right, which if I may, Pat, that is one of the reasons why we have to put a lot of effort in the prevention aspect of earthquake awareness. I think what we need to also ensure is that, earthquake season 1st to December 31st. People need to understand it's not just earthquake week in January, but you have one church service. And
Parris, your connection wobbling again.
I'm sorry, I'm weird. Yeah, what I'm saying is that earthquake season is from January 1 to December 31st every single year, and that we need to continue to build the awareness. But the fact is that the awareness for the general public is different from the awareness for regulators, for financiers. All of these guys have a different bar that we need to meet in terms of helping them to understand. And you don't need to regulate common sense, right? If insurance people and financiers can understand that their risk of insuring or providing mortgages to certain types of structures that don't meet engineering standards, then you are able to get them to think differently, and therefore the builder and you as the customer of that penthouse structure would think twice.
But that is where I believe Pat is saying that we're skylarking.
Well, I am also adding to that. I'm adding the public must be informed of the type of construction that's happening. There's too much secrecy. Buildings are going up without anybody knowing. Suddenly people living and there's an apartment hanging over their fence. Yep. It is wrong in terms of mitigation and hurricane strategies. In fact, in Turkey, they had allowed a lot of green areas, a lot of open spaces for earthquake evacuation. What happened in Turkey? The government officials sold them off for development, and so they lack the open spaces. Kingston was designed as both earthquake and hurricane mitigation. The entire place was a certain height. We're not saying every building must be single story, double story, but they were laid out in such a way that they would allow for hurricane mitigation and earthquake mitigation. The construction technology changed after the 1907 earthquake. Yep. In fact, you're better off living in an older structure than you are living in one of the modern ones. And I would add that many of the small buildings going around with the block and steel, Jamaicans know you put steel inside the pocket. You have a lady spending her money and throwing her partner and putting up a little house in a certain neighborhood. She is standing up over them and say, where is steel there?
I'd love to continue this, but my engineer is telling me that we're out of time. I want to thank both of you, Dr. Parris, Lyew-Ayee, former Executive Director of Mona Geoinformatics Institute, and architect Dr. Pat Green. Thank you both. You've been very helpful to me today.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having us.
Good. We take a break. Welcome back. It's Jamaica Live. We're on Bridge 99. We're also on Irish Jam in New York. We do this every Monday between 12 and 2. We take an issue that we think is relevant, we think is something that commands interest, we think it's something that is important. And we try to spend the time, the 2 hours that we have, looking at it from every possible perspective to enable us, and this is what I hope is the outcome of all of this, enable my listeners to have a better understanding and to be able to, form their own judgments and so on in terms of what we are doing and what we should do. Today we're talking about Jamaica's earthquake vulnerability, the fact that we sit on a major earthquake fault line, and because of that, we've been lucky, We have not had a major earthquake here since 1907. That's before most, if not all of us, were born. And perhaps we have become kind of complacent. We kind of think that, well, boy, it's not going to happen. But as I was pointing out when we opened the program, when an earthquake comes in, it don't give you no warning, You're not going to see no birds behaving funny in the trees because them smell something. It's just going to hit you. And what we wanted to do today is to look at our vulnerability, to recognize that is our fate, no? But also to look at what are we doing to minimize the damage that could result if an earthquake were to strike, because there are things that can be done. The way we design our buildings, the way we enforce those building requirements, and so on. So we're very pleased now to be joined by Miss Dionne Chambers. Now, she is the manager responsible for National Spatial Strategy at NEPA, the National Environmental Planning Agency. They're a major part of our regulatory framework, and I want to talk with her to hear from her in terms of her perspective. Ms. Chambers, are you there?
Yes, I am. Thank you, Mr. Golding.
And thank you so much. Thank you for joining me.
Yes.
My guest that I had on before you came on, Professor Clayton, Mr. Peter Jervis, who is an engineer, Dr. Parris, Lyew-Ayee, Dr. Patricia Green. They basically said, look, we're going to get hit by a hurricane, by an earthquake. We've been lucky so far, but that luck is going to run out at some point. We're going to get one, and we're going to get a big one. Now, from your perspective, from NEPA's perspective, how are we? The people I spoke with today seem to be satisfied that our building codes, our building requirements are adequate. They express concern, however, about the enforcement of that. And I know that that enforcement is not entirely within NEPA's gift and responsibility. But would you agree that our building requirements or building code, that they are sufficient, they are appropriate for the kind of earthquake vulnerability that we have?
So, good afternoon to you again and your listeners. I just want to say that from where I sit in the National Environment and Planning Agency, NEPA, we do not give approval for buildings. However, we have to consult and we also comment on the building code when it is being formulated or when it is to be approved. We have to give comments on that. What I can share with you is from the perspective of NEPA, what we do, we have a very broad and comprehensive approach to looking at our applications processing, and we look at the submissions, and we have to do a very structured assessment of what is presented to us. So from where we are at NEPA, we play a very supportive role to the Office of Disaster Preparedness and Emergency Management, which manages and monitors all preparedness towards earthquakes. And as part of our permits and license process, we have to ensure that all design criteria are met. The agency has employed an architect and a structural engineer, and they have to go through the plans and the proposals that are presented to us and ensure that they're sound and they're okay so that you can approve them to go on. In addition, all plans that are submitted to the National Environment and Planning Agency must be certified by a locally registered architect and also a locally registered engineer. So the drawings have to be checked. They have to be structurally sound, and so we depend on them to ensure that all design criteria is met and that buildings can be constructed with the with the soundness and be structurally sound to ensure that our people can operate within them and around them.
Where are you in terms of your development orders? Because my understanding is that there has to be a development order for each parish, which sort of lays out a framework that would inform the type of structures that can go up and where. How are you doing with that?
So with regards to the development orders, we are in a good place. The National Environment and Planning Agency, through the Town and Country Planning Authority, now has the entire island covered by a development order.
The entire island?
Yes. The development order, as you mentioned, it's the legal document that guides development within the area to which it applies.
Yes.
And it can be a specialized area. It can be an entire parish.
Yes.
It can be a section of a parish, such as Negril is a section of a parish that is covered by a development order.
But you're saying that the entire island is now covered?
The entire island.
Well,
and let me put the context to that.
Mm-hmm.
The entire island we have confirmed development orders for most parishes, and we have provisional development orders which are used for material consideration. So for the entire, right now, we have Westmoreland area, and why Westmoreland area? It's because Negril forms a part of Westmoreland. So that section is taken out, and Negril and Green Island area has an order for themselves. Mm-hmm. We have the Westmoreland, Clarendon, St. Catherine, St. Mary, and Portland currently have.
Those are confirmed?
Yes, confirmed. Recently also being revised. We're looking through them again. We also have Trelawney, we have St. Anne, we have Manchester, We have the entire island is covered.
Yes.
We have provisional orders, however, for Hanover, St. James, which is soon to be confirmed. We recently got the approval from the St. James Municipal Corporation. We have St. Elizabeth, we have Kingston and St. Andrew, which is to be approved shortly, and we have St. Thomas in provisional. But those are still based on the detailed assessments that we would have done in these parishes, and also the policies and guidelines that we use. We look at rural area policies, we look at general development policies, and we look at sector policies. And all these are based on the different integrated development plans that the various ministries, departments, and agencies would have for the areas that falls within their responsibility in the respective parishes.
Where are you, Dionne, in terms of the National Spatial Plan?
The National Spatial Plan, I can speak just a little bit to that. The National Spatial Plan, a draft was prepared in 2019, and it went into circulation for comment. We were a part of the technical working group for that. The process was led by the Ministry of Economic Growth and Job Creation. However, it is still in discussion. My understanding is that it is to be brought to the Cabinet for approval. It is still in discussion at the Ministry. But I can say that a draft National Spatial Plan was prepared, it was circulated, it was properly commented on by professional bodies, ministries, agencies, and departments. So it is at the Ministry, and we're awaiting their final decision on that National Spatial Plan.
Now tell me, back to the question of earthquake vulnerability.
Yes.
And I accept the point that you made that you don't approve buildings, but
No,
you are
we don't.
consulted and your advice is sought.
Yes.
Is there, given the nature of our vulnerability to earthquakes, given that we sit on more than one fault line, is there anywhere in Jamaica that because of the subsoil conditions that no building ought to be put there?
So I don't want to get too specific because it's not my area of expertise, but what I can say is when the development orders are being prepared, we look at, there's a hazard risk map that we review.
Yes.
We also collect information on detailed studies that would have been done by the respective universities. We also consult with Geoinformatics at the university as well, and we consult with the earthquake department and the mines and geology division.
Yes.
What we get from them are the maps that shows us the fault lines across the different areas in the parishes. And what we try to do as much as is possible, we try not to propose intense development in some of those areas because you can't totally get away from it. You still have to have development there. However, for those, when those areas are being developed in a particular way, it has to be checked by the engineers that must ensure that all the requisite building standards are met to ensure the integrity of the structures.
The reason why I raised that question with you, and I don't want to take you out of your lane, right?
Sure.
But the reason why I raised that question with you is that I was a little unnerved when Dr. Parris, Lyew-Ayee, pointed out. I asked him the question, the same way we lost 2/3 of Port Royal in whatever that year was. You would remember, my brain too fuzzy. But in the same way that a section of Port Royal just sank, he said that he expressed some concern that some of the same characteristics exist in Portmore. The difference, of course, being that Portmore have hundreds of thousands of people. Port Royal didn't have so many. So I hope it is something that the regulators and so on are taking into account in terms of two things. In terms of what kind of development is approved for there, and B, whether or not there is some retrofitting work. Peter Jervis said that even if a structure has already been erected, there's retrofitting work that can be done to reduce its vulnerability in the event of an earthquake.
So we're aware because we would have, been a part of groups that have that kind of discussion. What I know as well, the building department of the various municipal corporation, or in the case of Portmore, the Portmore Municipal Council, would have to arbitrate out over the plans. They would have had to look at the type of structures, the sub-base, and all of that. As you mentioned, it's not my area of expertise, so I wouldn't want to delve into it, but I know that there is a rudimentary approach to looking at structures that are being built and to ensure that the integrity of the foundation and those structures are maintained.
I want to put a question to you, and I hope it don't cause discomfort, because I don't want to discomfort you at all. But look, you mentioned before what role NEPA plays, right? And
yes,
NEPA does
NEPA.
play an important role.
Yes,
you
do.
mentioned as well the important role that has to be played by a registered architect, registered structural engineer, and so on.
Yeah.
But let us say I'm a developer. I engage a Tapanaris architect, and I engage a big structural engineer. When my application comes in, even though their credentials are good, they are not infallible.
Sure.
And they are not immune to cutting corners. Does NEPA have the skill set that can look at what they say and don't care how much engineering degrees they have behind the name, but look and say, no, this is not suitable? The reason why I ask that question is because the local authorities that actually give the building approval, they don't have those skill sets, Dionne. So I hope that in terms of the advisory role that you are playing, I hope you have those skill sets to say, look, we cannot recommend that you approve this particular project because this one will come down if an earthquake were to strike.
Sam, I'm glad you asked that question. Here at NEPA, as part of our cadre of expertise, we have a registered architect on staff and we have a structural engineer on staff. It's a lot of work for them at times, but they have the responsibility to go through the plans and review the plans with respect to the various requirements that they need to meet. And I must say as well that they often accompany our enforcement officers that go out to check and ensure that our permits and license conditions are being adhered to in terms of the layout of your site. I also want to mention, importantly too, we have those skill sets going out to ensure that we have tanks. So we have to not only consider the buildings on land, we also have to consider tanks, underground tanks for petrol filling stations, and also tanks for and pipelines for that has to deal with hazardous material. So we also have persons here on staff that have to look at the plans that are submitted to us, and every 3 years rather, we have a report that must be done, and it's a structural integrity test report that is done for all hydrocarbon tanks, that's the petrol filling tanks, and also all hazardous material storage tanks, whether or not they're above ground or below. So we try to have a very robust system that monitors, assess, and evaluate on an ongoing basis.
Does NEPA network with other regulatory bodies, say in California, in Tokyo, other countries that have serious, even greater exposure to earthquakes than we have, so that you can kind of lean on their own experience whenever you have a ticklish issue that you have to resolve?
Yes, I want to say yes. However, I don't want my CEO to probably think that I'm throwing something out there. However, since the advent of COVID-19, we have not been able to have the study tours that we would normally have. But a lot of staff members have benefited from doing study tours with technical expertise that deals with quite a broad array of subject matters, not only for buildings, but also for setting up your solar panels and your wind farm. And because we have to look at all of those come together. If we have an earthquake, all of those resources will be impacted. And so We do have study tours. We've had them all over the island and also in the Caribbean, where we go and get a window into what are some of the best practices. I would have benefited from going to Germany years ago and also to China. I went to China in 2013 and I went to Germany in 2010. But we have quite a bit of staff here who have benefited from that kind of training internationally, and we also partner with our local or Caribbean brothers and our local people. We depend a lot at times on instructions from the universities, University of the West Indies and also University of Technology, to assist us when we're doing projects or when we're looking at special areas for a certain type of development, particularly dense development. We tend to ask for the support of the universities so that the universities can assist us by guiding us. Sometimes the new
makes a lot of sense.
Expertise in training, we actually co-opt them to be a part of our projects. We ask them to do pilots, assist us with creating designs. We also have, as part of the agency, we do modeling. We may have limitations, but we do modeling, we do 3D simulation, and we look at what the outcome of a development proposal could look like, and also what are the potential impacts. And we try to, as much as is possible, reduce and mitigate those impacts through consultation with the developers.
Yes.
We're not perfect, but we're trying to get it as right as possible.
Yeah, well, I support you on that. I want to thank you very much for coming on today. Thank you very much for helping us to understand some of the issues involved. Thank you so much, Dionne Chambers.
Thank you so much, Mr. Golding.
Manager of National Spatial Strategy at NEPA. That's what we've been talking about today, the question of earthquake. And hear what the gentleman them say. We haven't had a major earthquake in Jamaica for over 100 years, right? What they basically say is that time is running out. They say it's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when. And that when could be tomorrow. Could be even tonight. Or maybe next week, or maybe next month, or maybe next year, maybe 5 years' time. But what they were saying, and they didn't intend to frighten us, they just want to alert us that we're going to have a major earthquake in Jamaica at some point. And we need to do two things. One, we need to make sure that the way in which we operate above ground is such that it can withstand even a hurricane of the even an earthquake of the intensity of the one that hit Turkey. So that, yes, we're going to suffer some damage, but we mustn't suffer a whole heap of thousands of people being killed. And the second thing that we have to do is that we need to prepare ourselves that if an earthquake were to happen, what do we do? I know they tell us, well, run outside of the house. Don't stay in the house because the house may collapse on you. But what do we as a community, as a people do? Remember what Professor Clayton said? He said the majority of people who are rescued after an earthquake are rescued by people, citizens, not by, ADPEM and National Works Agency and Fire Brigade. Because by the time they are to get there, most of the people who going dead already. He said that the people have to be sensitized so that we have earthquake awareness week in January. Most of the time we don't pay no attention, we don't pay no mind because earthquake, we never hear about that yet. No, we have to get serious. And what it is going to require is that a whole program of public education, public sensitization needs to be done, starting in the schools. That look, if an earthquake strike, this is what you can expect. You can expect buildings going to collapse. You can expect that you're going to hear some people bawling from under the rubble for help. This is how you go about helping them. This is how you go about trying to respond to the crisis that will be facing you. There's a lot of work that we have to do because our luck will run out one day. God has been good, God has been good to us and bless us because we have had a major earthquake in over 100 years. But I'm sure that God blessed Turkey too, and look at what happened to them. I'm sure that God not vexed with Haiti either. any more than, them vexed with us. But look at what happened to Haiti. So I really want to thank all my guests, Professor Anthony Clayton, Sir Peter Jervis, Dr. Parris Lyew-Ayee, Dr. Patricia Green, and Miss Dionne Chambers. Bo is still there? Beauregard? No, look as if he has left me.
Yes, Mr. Golden, sir.
Oh, you're still there?
Yes, sir, I'm here.
Yeah, signing off now. I think we have had a useful discussion. I hope people take it serious.
Yes, they do, sir. This is very good conversation, especially talking about being prepared. This is something that out of nowhere can affect anybody during your sleep, during any hour of the day.
That's right. I mentioned that I was in Antigua last month, and a 6.2 hit. And I was in my hotel room, and all of a sudden I started feeling the shaking. And I never really panicked at that stage, but after about 5 seconds, the whole room started wobbling all over the place.
Yes, sir.
And that's when I got scared. That's when I go stand up under the door jam.
I've also had earthquake experiences, sir. Here in the United States, we'd have some tremors before, but one in particular when I was a youth back in Jamaica, I believe it was in 1985, somewhere around there. I was still in primary school going to Dionne Park, and we had went to a school trip somewhere on Constant Spring Road. It was an historic site. It was a house, and we were in there. The students were looking around, and all of a sudden the place just started shaking. Yeah. I distinctly remember one young man running out of the house and jump off of the veranda out in the yard.
It was a frightening thing.
Yes, it was very scary, sir.
And you see, when it starts shaking, if it just shake and stop is one thing, but when it keeps shaking, you don't know how much longer it will shake.
Yep.
And how much damage is likely to be done.
And one of the things we like to tell the people in Jamaica and to anybody who's listening anywhere, if you do feel or experience earthquake, the best thing to do is to, if you're out in the street, stand in the middle of the road.
Yes.
That way buildings that are falling cannot fall again and so forth.
Yes. Bo, nice to hear from you.
You too, sir. Have a wonderful rest of your week.
Good. Thank you so much. Same to you.
Take care.
That brings us to the end of the program. My thanks to my producer, Tamar Campbell, my engineer. Thank all the people who joined us, who tuned in. Want to thank the YouTube listeners as well, because I'm told, I must check on it myself, but I'm told that the responses on YouTube, on a YouTube channel, have been quite strong. Of course, some people disagree with us, with some of the things that we might say, but that's good. What we're happy about is that people are paying attention and people are engaging themselves in the topics that we discuss here. So thank all of you, thank my listeners. We'll be back next week Monday, God's willing, and provided we don't have an earthquake between now and then, to do it all over again. Jamaica Live on Bridge 99.